When it came time to pick colors or a color for the interior part, the center part of each of these snake plant leaves, I couldn't decide what to do because this shade of green that we are using was a little too dark and this one was a little too light. So what did I do? I used both of them. And that means that I used one strand of each of those colors. Can you see that? There you go. And I have played around with this method before of combining strands, different colored strands, and it's really a lot of fun. Sometimes you just sort of see what you get when you do it. But you can see over here, I've already used it over here, and so sometimes the lighter one shows and sometimes the darker one shows, and it's just a really interesting way to just add a little bit more interest to your color without having to buy, and that's the thing, I didn't want to make everybody buy yet another green because we already have, several here, and I just didn't want to add another one in there. So that's what I did. So to stitch we're going to start with the center part. We're going to start with these sections between these zigzaggy lines, and it really is just a satin stitch, and all the stitches sort of head up. Whatever angle the leaf is at, that's the angle that we are going to stitch. Leave yourself a little bit of room for that lighter colored edging. So give yourself just a little bit of room there. And this is not precise satin stitch where, the edge has to be completely, perfectly all lined up. You don't have to worry about any edges here because all of this is interior. And we're gonna, put a little dark green in between each section. And I am not being very careful. Like I said, I don't care if that's ragged or not. That's a pretty long section. Now I'm going to come up and do this next section. I work from left to right, but it does not matter which direction you go. You could work left to right and then right to left and then left to right, however you want to do it. It saves a little more thread if you don't skip back over to the left, but it just doesn't matter. And it doesn't even really matter if you have a little bit of space where the two sections meet because, again, we're going to cover it up with that darker green. For some reason, it seems like the lighter green sort of ends up always being on top. I have no idea why. That's why I said it's really just kind of a surprise to see what ends up showing the most. So just fill in each of those sections with some quick, don't have to be too careful about it, satin stitch. Now I have two strands of the darkest green, and to make these lines in between each section, I'm just gonna, I don't even know what to call it. It's not really satin stitch. It's kind of a needle painty stitch. How's that for a technical term? It's just zigzaggy though. But it's just, I'm still gonna go make stitches that are straight up and down, but I'm just gonna cover where those sections meet with just stitches that are next to each other but are random lengths. So some are short, some are long. Maybe this is long and short stitch, but not really. Don't make them so long that it covers up the sections the lighter green sections. So make some of them pretty short, but make some of them a little bit longer. You just want to really, like a zigzag. And jump up to this one. It doesn't even have to be solid all the way across, because on a real snake plant, they're just random. Those are kind of close together. I don't know why I made those so close together. Should have moved that bottom one down a little bit. So I'm making these stitches a little bit shorter than these right here, because I don't want to just completely obliterate, you know, this section of lighter green. But that's it. I guess we'll call this the needle painty stitch. To create the kind of yellowy green outline on each of these leaves, we are going to use a couching stitch. And I like couching for, it makes a nice, it's good for if you need like a really smooth line or curved lines. It makes a very bold line. There's lots of things you can do with it. If you switch up the number of threads, or the thread that you lay on the fabric is called your surface thread. The one that you sew it down with is called the couching thread. I'll explain that more in just a minute. But you know, you could use different colors of yarn for the one that lays on the fabric, and a different color of thread that goes over. All sorts of things you can do with a couching stitch. You could do I almost did a split back stitch, or I almost did like a little bitty chain stitch, but I just thought that might be a little bulky, and that a couching stitch is going to give me a nice, you know, bold, smooth line. So to couch, I am going to use 6 strands for the surface thread, the one that lays on top of the fabric, and I'm going to use 1 strand of thread as my couching thread, the thread that sews the surface thread, attaches it to the fabric. And let me say briefly about the surface thread, the 6 strands. I always preach about, you know, stripping your strands to help them lay, you know, make prettier stitches and lay on the fabric better. But this is one time when I do not strip my threads. I want this to remain kind of a twisted, you know, round, you know, rope situation kind of a thing. So I don't strip them. You could, it'd be a slightly different look, not that big of a deal, but I just don't strip these. And to couch, the couching stitch, I'm going to come up. I have the 6 strands on one needle. I'm going to come up on one end, starting at the bottom, and there's a reason for that. And now I will take my other hand and I will hold that thread, and now I will take the 1 strand and I'll come up from the bottom on the line and just make a stitch that goes over that surface thread, and do that all the way up. Now this is a relatively straight line, not a lot of intricate curves. If I was doing intricate curves, I would put these couching stitches close together to like really keep this surface thread, you know, in place. But honestly, this is such a, I mean, this is ending up being a little less than 1/4 of an inch apart, but you just don't want it to be too far apart. Now what I'm going to do up here at the top, let me get up there. And okay, so I could come up to the top and I could put a attaching stitch, a couching stitch right up here at this point, and I could bring the thread and I could work back down. It would probably be fine. I kind of am picky about the point here on this. I want it to be, because you know, a snake plant has a really sharp point. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the needle that has the 6 strands on it, and I'm going to go down to the back and pull it through. And I'm essentially going to end that thread right there. I'm going to knot it on the back, cut it, and I'm going to start, in fact, you know what, it's just right here, so I'm not even going to bother knotting and cutting and all that. I'm going to start back here at the bottom of that leaf. Like this one, this leaf right here, I might cut it and knot it and start over, but whatever, doesn't really matter. I'm going to start at the bottom, Do the same thing, and it doesn't matter, I don't think I said this yet, it doesn't matter if I come up on the outside of the thread and go down on the inside, or if I come up on the inside and go over the outside, doesn't matter, just sew that thread onto the fabric. Now here's the reason that I worked back up to the top, and that is so that I can now take this down. And instead of having a curve or a curve around that point, I'm going to make it, now it'll be a nice sharp point there where those two lines meet, just like that. And that's how you couch. We're now going to work on this friendship plant, and I think the actual name for it is like Pelea peperomoides, if that's how you say it, but that is a mouthful, so I'm just going to refer to it as the friendship plant. And to stitch each of these leaves, we're going to use satin stitch, but it's not the satin stitch, or it's not the same exact way we stitched the satin stitch over here, where all of the stitches were parallel to each other. These are obviously going to be in a circle. It is complicated by the fact that some of these are really small circles. This one in the center is probably going to be the easiest because it's the most round and it's the largest. But these here on the sides, like this one was really small, these on the sides are ovals with sort of an off-center point that we're going to use. So here is what we need to do in order to fit all of these satin stitches into this small oval shape. I call this kind of satin stitching in an arc. In this instance, it's going to be in a disc, but here's why it's different. So I'm going to make my first stitch. Let me explain it while I do it. I'm going to make my first stitch, and this is going to be our quote unquote center point. It's off center, but this is going to be the point at where all of these stitches converge. So there's my first stitch. Now if I continue around this entire oval, making all of my stitches this exact same length, it's not going to work. There is a lot more space, like let's say from here to here I need to put 5 stitches. I can fit those 5 stitches along this edge because I have a lot of space. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. When I get in here, right here, I have very little space. I cannot cram 5 stitches, much less the however many total stitches we're going to use all the way around, into this one spot. There's not enough room. So what I need to do is, I will be very careful about coming up outside my pattern line, but right next to where that stitch came up. And instead of making a full length stitch, I'm going to take my needle, I'm going to back off from that center point, that point where everything supposedly goes down, and I'm going to go make it a slightly shorter stitch and go slightly under the stitch that I just made. So what that does is it allows me to change the angle a little bit without making a full length stitch. And because this is such a small area and I have to cram a lot of stitches that can all converge into one tiny area, I'm going to do this a lot. I'm going to make these shorter stitches. Even the shorter stitches, I'm not going to make them all the same length. Some are going to be quite a bit shorter. Some are going to be just barely short of a full length stitch. That one was really short. I'm going to go back up just a little bit. That was 4 stitches. Now I think maybe it's time to do a full length stitch. And I started on, I meant to mention this before, I started in an area where my stitches are going to be the longest. So this little point, these stitches right here are going to be really short. It doesn't really matter where you start, it's where on the disc, on the outside edge you start. It's just a little easier to start and see what you're doing when your stitches are a little bit longer to begin with. So now I just made a full length stitch. I'm going to start shortening my stitches again. I'm going to make this one really short. That's like halfway of the stitch, half the length of the stitch that I just made. Each time being very careful to come up right next to the stitch, the end of the previous stitch. Going to make that one about 2/3. Go ahead and make that one a little shorter. Maybe make that one sort of full length. Now it does get a little, it's the same concept, even though you're getting into these areas that are really short stitches. And some of these stitches, like on this one over here, these stitches from here to here, especially the ones that weren't quote unquote full length stitches, they're small, but you need to make them in order to fill the outside edge, if that makes sense. I'm going to make that one shorter and slightly underneath. This one's shorter. And just to determine how often you need to make the stitches shorter, just keep an eye on this angle. You always want the angle to head towards this main point, and I'm trying to keep just a teensy bit of fabric right here from being unstitched because I'm going to be putting a French knot. I mean, if you know, realistically you're not going to end up with a piece of fabric that doesn't have any stitches in it, but I'm just trying to leave a little bit of opening right there. Just keep an eye on your angles. Sometimes in this situation I will need to perhaps cross over the previous stitch. In fact, often you will, but particularly in these really small areas. So now it's time for me to make a really short stitch. And another really short stitch. So here's where the little tiny stitches come in. Try to keep my hand out of the way so you can see what I'm doing, even though I'm stitching on the opposite side now. I'm a big fan of turning my work so that it's the most comfortable for me to stitch. I think my stitches are always better when my hand is comfortable and my brain can see it the way it wants to see it. So you don't always have to keep your hoop static. So having said that, let me go turn my hoop. All right, I'm turned around now so I can be a little more comfortable while I'm stitching. It's easier for me since I'm right-handed to go like this. And this is the trickiest part, right up here where these stitches are so short. But in order to be, you know, somewhat realistic with these leaves, I couldn't put the little center dot right in the dead center because that's not, you know, based on the angle of the way these leaves look like they're facing you, the little dot is not always right in the center. It's up near the stem. So that is the main thing. That's how you do this very tight arc or circle or disc when you're satin stitching. Some of these do get a little piled up on each other, but just do the same thing around and around, and you should if you do this, you should not be fighting to get that needle down in the center, because if the needle is always going down in the same spot, you've got a lot of thread crammed in there, and there's just eventually you get to the point where you can't even get the needle down in the fabric. Do this all the way around and you will have a completed leaf. For the little point where the stem meets the underside of the leaf, we are going to put one French knot. I am using 2 strands of thread, and I'm going to wrap each knot twice. 2 strands, wrap twice. The last thing to do to finish up this friendship plant is to put in, just use 2 strands to do a split back stitch for all of the stems. And I'm using the same color that we used for the French knots in the center of each leaf. Whoa, last stitch, huge knot. Isn't that perfect? Let me see if I can tease it out. Maybe this is a good time to talk about knots. This one is a particularly spectacular one. Okay, the rule for knots is if you get one, don't yank on it really hard. More than likely, it is just the threads twisting up on themselves. Sometimes it makes a little, like a little slip knot. You just have to put the needle into the loop and pull on either leg, either this leg of the thread or this leg, and it generally will just slide to the needle, and then you can slip the needle out and then just pull the thread and it pops out. So this one, you can see, was really not a slip knot. It was really just the thread twisting on itself. See how it's all twisty like that? I just pulled it too fast. So all I did, I didn't pull hard. If I'd kept pulling, it might have really just snagged up and been hard to get out. But because I didn't pull too hard or didn't keep tugging on it when I saw the knot, and I kind of gently teased it apart, it was really just twisted up thread. So how's that for a spectacular last stitch? For the pothos leaves, we are going to use, big shocker, the satin stitch. I know. And like most satin stitching, this one is all about the angles, but we're also going to toss in a little bit of fun with the color. So let me explain to you how I did it, and then in a minute I'm going to explain maybe a way if you want to simplify it just a little bit, simplify the angles. So here's what I did. So I started out with the, well, let me show you this. Let me back up. Let me find a different pen. Okay, let's talk about the angles that each side of these leaves are going to have. The stitches down here at towards the tip are going to go up that direction, like I always like for them to do for the tip. And as we go around the shape of this heart-shaped leaf, this is going to be the angle, okay, like this. So that's sort of the basic plan for the angles. And then what I did was I started out with the brightest green, and I put in, I don't even know how these markers are going to react on top of that blue marker, that blue pen. But anyway, I put in, well, let me do it over here. I put in a few random bright green stitches spaced out for, these are those pothos leaves that have, I can't remember the exact name of them, but they're the ones that have like a little splash of bright green, a little splash of white in them. They're not just solid green. So that's what this is. That's that little splash of the bright green, and just space them out, but keep in mind your angles, not your ankles, your angles. And then the same thing over here, maybe 2 here and 1 here and 1 up there. All right. Now I come back with the slightly darker green and I begin my satin stitching. You can start at the top or the bottom, whichever you are the most comfortable with. I did these, especially up here on this rounded part. That was the part that's a little bit tricky. And I did the good old, satin stitch in an arc, because that's what this is, where you're tucking those stitches underneath. So I started here and then tuck, 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 and then along about here, you can probably stop tucking and fill in between those bright green stitches like that. Hard to see with the blue on there. Let me show you over here. Say you wanted to start at the bottom, and then skip over that bright green one, start changing the angle a little bit, Maybe you might need to start tucking right here and then really tuck these in here to come around like that. If you are doing the leaves that there's just a couple of them, maybe even just one of these leaves that look like it's folded, go start out with the same thing with the bright green, add a couple of stitches, then come back with the next green, the more medium green, just like kind of like you did the other, but only in a half, like that. So let's say you don't even want to bother with the whole satin stitching in an arc. These are small leaves. That was just me being kind of picky. And if you don't want to do that, here is an alternative. Here's the same leaf. You want to do the colors the same. Oh, and about the colors, you don't even have to start with the bright green. You'd come in and you could do all of the medium green and then come put some of the light green on top. I don't even know why I started with the light green, not something specific. If it's easier for you to just do all the medium green and then add the light green, a couple of random stitches on top, do that. But let's say you're doing it like I did it and you're starting out with the light green, and instead of, well, let me just show you. Instead of doing the whole thing where you change the angle as you go around this way, just keep your satin stitches all parallel like this. And you know what? That will be totally fine. You do not have to mess with that whole satin stitch in an arc and changing angles if you don't want to. If that's easier for you, absolutely do that, okay? Now that I've explained all of that, I will just show you here some stitching. I'm going to do it with the satin stitch in an arc technique, but again, it's just not that big of a deal if you don't want to do that. I did all of the other ones that way, so I'm just going to be consistent and do these the same way. So there's my bright green. Put that thread aside and grab, 1 minute. All right, I have that kind of light medium green. I'm using 2 strands just like I used 2 strands also for the bright green. And I'm just gonna start up here at this top part. Whoops, I'm gonna start on the outside edge. I'm not putting an outline around the edge of these because they're so tiny. I mean, they're so small. That's just a little bit of overkill. That is more outlining than I want to do. And I'll hop over that bright green stitch. See this wedge shape right here? So now I'm going to tuck that one underneath. Tuck this one, make it shorter, tuck it underneath. Probably have to tuck this one underneath a little bit. And maybe I can fit one more right. Come on, find the right spot right there. Hop over here. If you cover up the bright green a little bit, it's fine. I'm just trying to convey that kind of splotchy color on this type of pothos leaf. Same thing here. Just fill in this kind of wedge shape, this pie shape. So I'll tuck a few of these stitches underneath and make a few of them full length. Make that one smaller, shorter. And then down here at the tip. One more stitch, hopefully, maybe. Okay, all right, there's that half. And there's the second half done. And now I'm going to add just a few little small random stitches of white on each side. Because again, like I said, those pothos leaves have just some sort of white blotchy spots on them. These don't have to be full length stitches. I am just kind of being careful that they don't get buried in the other stitches. Like I'm not pulling too hard. And they don't really have to go in a certain space. But you'd be surprised what 3 little white stitches, you know, how much they can brighten up those leaves. Because I didn't have them at first and it seemed like they were missing something, and when I added that white, it really just made those leaves look really more realistic. And even though these leaves have kind of a natural line where the two sides meet, I wanted it to be just a teeny bit more defined. So I'm using only one strand of the darkest green and just putting a little line of, I honestly can't remember if I did backstitch or split stitch or split backstitch. Doesn't really matter. Just put a little line of dark green. And just like the white, you wouldn't think that one strand and 3 little stitches could make such a difference, but it really does help to give that center vein some definition.